My name's Harald Richter. I'm a senior scientist in the Bureau of Meteorology. And looks like you're getting a string of us at this time of day today. Now, this is collaborative work on wind impact forecasting that we carried out over the last 3 years in collaboration with a partner agency, Geoscience Australia, that John already mentioned. So 2 federal agencies involved here, or Commonwealth agencies. And the ambitious part of our project is that we went quantitative with impact forecasting. Most of impact forecasts that I've seen tend to overlay layers, tend to stay in the qualitative realm, and we attempted to construct a quantitative workflow. Now, the motivation, by partnering with Geoscience Australia, we actually gained access to vulnerability and exposure data sets for residential buildings around Australia, and the Bureau could provide the hazard. So we had the complete set of data available to attempt to construct a quantitative wind impact model for residential buildings. However, the construction of an impact product was relatively simple compared to then showing, well, is it actually any good? So the difficulty really came a bit later in the project, and that's shown here in red. After all this effort, do we actually have something that's better than just a plain hazard forecast? So the talk now is in 2 parts. I'll first take you through how did we construct a quantitative wind impact output, followed by how did we go about showing that this is actually a step forward rather than we just created a pretty picture and haven't got much else to show for it. So starting with the hazard, here is 4 incarnations of the hazard that we produced. We produced it from our high resolution city model output. That's a convection allowing model based on the unified model from the Met Office. It runs on a 1.5 kilometer grid. And as it's been pointed out before, there's a difference between a meteorological output field and a hazard. We weren't quite sure at the start what kind of wind actually is best related to the wind impact or wind damage on residential buildings. So we tried 4 output types here. The 10 meter mean wind, the 10 meter gust. This is 10 meter above ground level, 3-second gust lengths, roughly. The wind about 1 kilometer above ground level. It's conceivable, maybe that's a better estimator given model error, that this is more closely related to wind-based damage on buildings. And a neighborhood gust, where we thought, let's make it a really pessimistic scenario and say we take, within a 40-kilometer radius, we take the strongest 10-meter gusts that we can find and allocate it to the entire neighborhood. The exposure information comes from the National Exposure Information System that's hosted by Geoscience Australia. That's the Nexus system. Contains building information, but as you can see here, it's not just building information, it contains a whole lot more. Now, what was relevant to our project about Nexus, and this is probably a first pertinent take-home message, is it's unlikely that in any country, really, all the buildings are surveyed in terms of all the attributes like wall type, roof type, age, how many stories, and any of those attributes really being a proxy for vulnerability in the end, or for how a building would react to wind impact, or to the wind hazard rather. And the case study that I will show you in a couple of minutes looked at an area that had largely so-called statistically inferred building attributes. So the wall types, roof types were never surveyed. They actually had to be inferred from the surrounding buildings. And that inference, as it turns out, is actually a major source of uncertainty in the exposure data. The vulnerability information, probably even more uncertainty in these. Again, we didn't have direct data-based vulnerabilities for the buildings for which we produced the wind impact forecast. And we're working together with a wind engineer from Geoscience Australia. And we effectively took the best wind vulnerability data set that was available at the time and still is available. But best doesn't necessarily mean that this is really spot on in terms of how the individual buildings would react, where you would expect a huge amount of spread. If you just think about what kind of damaged landscape you would assume, if a uniform strong wind field impacts a row of houses, one house might be unroofed, and once the roof is gone, the house get pressure, effectively the walls might cave in and so on. And then the house next door, so the roof doesn't lift off because it's better anchored, and the whole structure holds together. So there's huge variability in this game, how a house would respond to, in this case, 0.2 second gust. So these vulnerability curves is basically a translational curve. How would a building react to the hazard? And it translates that into the actual impact on the vertical, which in this case is a repair cost or a damage index. So that's basically how big is the damage as a percentage of the full replacement cost for the structure. So we made attempts at data-driven vulnerability functions, but that really didn't go all that well, and I'll come back to why it didn't. It is actually related to the structure of the impact data that's available. So the ultimate impact forecast, having gone into exposure, vulnerability, and showing the 4 variants of hazard that we used. The 4 hazard types again are shown in the top row here. And the bottom row shows you the impact output in response to the hazards at the top. And you can see the sensitivity of the quantitative wind impact in our model to the input hazard. We can effectively produce not just negligible impacts if we use the 10-meter mean wind. We can then ramp it up as we step through using the gusts or the gradient level wind at 900 hectopascal a kilometer above the ground, or we can make things look really scary if we use this neighborhood wind gust method. So now comes the verification part. This was the production part of the
Have we lost Harald?
Seems to be frozen. Let's see. I'm not sure what to do because he won't see a chat. He's probably noticing a problem on his end, I'd guess.
He may not. He may still keep on ploughing on.
Yeah. Okay. Not sure what's the right thing to do. I could send him a text.
I might send him a quick email too, just in case he might pick that up.
Yeah, it's dropped out completely. All right. Well, while we're getting Harald back, Adnan, would you and John like to have some discussion about predicting heat waves?
Now, I think Adnan was saying that he's in a working office where he can't talk.
Yeah, he did say that. That's right. Okay.
So I have written him back an answer to part of his question.
Yeah, it's a big question, isn't it?
It's a very big question. I mean, I can talk about it for a moment, but frequently people do want to see humidity in their heat wave indices. I haven't found it necessary. and the literature is littered with humidity as a confounding element. So it's quite useful, I think, to actually have done it without humidity and then seen how well it works in the tropics. So so I'm producing a paper very shortly where I've considered both a wet and a dry version of the AHF in reanalysis data, and I'm analysing that right now. So it'll be interesting to see how the comparison comes out. Adnan's responded, so that's okay.
Yeah, so he's listening, just can't say anything.
Yes. I think the tropics is most interesting when monsoons are delayed or fail, and that's when you can see a lot of heat build up, particularly over continental land masses. And then people see humidity get combined with that very hot air, but you had to build the hot air first. And I think that's part of the story across regions that are influenced by the monsoon and those humid air masses. But anyway, it's interesting. Harold's back.
Harold's back.
I'm back. Yes, I think I had an internet dropout. It's one of the better failure modes. With your permission, may I reshare my screen?
Of course you can.
Okay, here you go. I don't know how long I was talking to myself for.
So you were just about to start on verification. So you had just opened up your slide on, yes, this one. You just put it up when you dropped out.
Okay. Yep. So yeah, the verification data sets, I don't know whether that came across. The left data set, EICU, is from the Emergency Information Coordination Unit. That's a professional emergency management agency going out into the field, assessing the damage around the buildings. It's a high quality data set, but it's only in a few locations. To the right are state emergency service call outs. So they're individual citizens calling to the state emergency services saying, I've got a problem, please come and help. So these are the two data sets that we had available. I'll be focusing on the left data set, given it actually gives us a rating of the damage state in 5 categories, so we know how much damage was done. The dataset on the right had the issue that a call out could be for anything from my power failed to all the way I've got 6 trees that crashed into my house and my house is gone. So in terms of the verification, how can we actually show we're doing better than just a plain wind forecast? We thought that would be a real easy thing to do. Well, turned out not to be, because the initial attempts showed we were actually adding no value by going to an impact forecast in terms of verification scores or general accuracy. And one of the reasons was that the damage data, even from the professional surveyors that we had available, needed to be heavily worked on and filtered before they were actually useful. And one of the major reasons of that is that the damage was not connected to the hazard that caused the damage. So what we had to do was all this filtering here, where we're effectively saying we need to isolate that part of the damage data set where we have high confidence this is actually due to the wind hazard, which is the only thing that we've modeled. We only have a wind impact model, not a multi-hazard impact model, which obviously has other difficulties associated in the modeling realm. So we looked at the reports, we filtered out entries that have the word inundation with it, water level, tree, non-residential buildings like warehouses and so on. And we filtered out reports where we looked at the model rainfall, and wherever it was raining heavily, we removed those as well to make sure we're not convoluting the damage reports with rain ingress. Then we categorized the damage in terms of, on the left-hand side, are the observations in the table. We had a 5-category system and a 3-category system. On the right-hand side is the modeled damage, again categorized as 5 and 3. And we aggregated it to so-called SA1 areas. Now, SA1 areas is if you attempt to divide a country into spatial areas that contain roughly the same number of people. So in this case, SA1 is roughly about 400 people as a sort of unit. So inside towns and cities, SA1 areas are very small, just less than a square kilometer. And in country areas, an SA1 area can be a fairly vast expanse. Now, I might probably skip some of the details here due to my dropout. There was a lot more thinking around how do we aggregate the observations to SA1 areas? Do we take the minimum damage observed within the area, the maximum? How do we basically aggregate from the building level to the SA1 level? And there are some better and definitely some worse ways of doing that. We ended up with this fancy looking formulation there. I had to have one formula in my presentation, and there it is. And eventually then we derived 4 different scores: percentage correct, the HIWeather score, the Gerity score. I won't go into what that is. That was Bess's recommendation, so maybe you ask her. And in a nutshell, after all this preparation work of the data, the very careful navigating through the data and the aggregating to the SA1 level, we referenced it to a wind-only forecast from the same model that you can see here, where we categorized the wind using standard operational criteria into no damage wind, where if it's less than 90 kilometers an hour, minor damage if it's between 90 and 120, and then the destructive wind in red. And using those categories for the wind-only forecast, we found, you can see the nitty-gritty table there, that the wind impact forecast had an edge over just a plain wind forecast as an estimator of residential building damage. So what are the lessons? This is the final slide. Lessons we've learned in Australia. So all these obviously are just relating to the case study that we've run. Hazard, exposure and vulnerability data for wind impact forecasting, so different from John's presentation earlier, exist and produce a modest but a meaningful wind impact forecast for residential buildings. Modest in the sense of, are we gaining on just a hazard forecast? Both the exposure and the vulnerability data sets have very significant uncertainties related to, there's some missing words there. They're related to things like having to infer building types where they're not directly surveyed, or having a lack of quantitative vulnerability relationships that are actually data-based. And that second one is probably one of the biggest weaknesses at the moment of quantitative impact forecasting. It's the availability of those vulnerability data. It's the quality of using vulnerability proxies, which in our case was a significant weakness. The third lesson learned is damage assessment data as they're being collected at the moment in Australia are what I would say is semi-suitable for verification. The biggest lack that separates them from being far more suitable is explicit links between the reported damage and the hazards that inflicted the damage, so that out of the damage data we can clearly say, okay, this is the contributing hazards, or in a simpler case, the hazard that caused the damage. And in case of the SES data in particular, damage state categorizations. So we have an idea, is this major damage, is this minor damage? That often isn't clear from the damage data. And finally, lessons learned, the verification scores show a modest but hope-inspiring edge over just using a hazard forecast. So we feel we are on the right track, i.e. involving exposure and vulnerability data and adding that to a hazard forecast is a promising path. But it feels to us we're right at the start of it when it comes to quantitative impact forecasting. And that was all from me. Thanks.
Thanks, Harold. Do we have any questions from the audience? Please raise your hand or just unmute yourself, I guess. I've got a question, Harold, and it relates to something that John said with the heatwave talk. And that has to do with the scale of the area that we're using with that you're using, which is quite fine actually, you know, the small SA1 regions. I understand that you might need to predict at that scale because the information about buildings can be quite different from one place to another, so the vulnerability might vary quite a lot. But for the purposes of actually issuing warnings and things, would it make more sense to scale up to a broader area, simply because the predictability at that fine scale might just be too tough for us?
It's a very interesting question, Beth, because there's so many takes on it. One thing that I increasingly became sensitive to is who's going to be the user of the impact forecast. And we had a lot of discussions with our state emergency service providers like the SES, the State Emergency Services, and other agencies. And they'd be interested in where can we deploy the resources. And we asked them explicitly at what scale would they be interested to receive the data. And the SA1 was actually the winner. Luckily, because it was in hindsight, it was during our second workshop after we'd done the work, they actually said, yeah, you chose the area that we like the most. And that one, so there's your client pull or customer pull. That one, of course, needs to stay in balance with what can we meaningful predict, at what scale should we aggregate to produce a scientifically more robust output. Within the project, we haven't run tests to say, let's go to an SA2 area, and I don't know how many people are in there, maybe 1,000 or 10,000 or even larger. Does the variability within that area hurt us? Because now we're sort of integrating over large areas meteorologically as well, housing-wise. So we haven't tested the sensitivity there, but it is the balance between those two things, perhaps.
Yeah, thanks. John, a quick question, and then we'll move on after that.
Yeah, look, it is that question of scale, SA1, SA2, SA3. It was very interesting to work with health because they didn't want to release data at SA3, only at SA3, whereas SA2 was judged to be the useful scale because that's virtually at the suburb level, which of course is the council level. So who's the most likely user of the data? Health and councils at that scale. So yeah, it's about the customer.
Yep, it's a good summary.
Thanks,
Okay, so thank you very much. Let's move to our final speaker for